Well, it seems like the Sony live-action Spider-Verse has finally come to an end. But could they be trading Spider-Man for a much, much bigger problem for comic book fans? Let's take a couple minutes to talk about the end of the live-action Spider-Man slate, and why, although this sounds like good news, it could be the worst news ever. Especially if you're a DC fan. Let's dive in. Well, to be fair, over its history, Sony has had some pretty big success with the Spider-Man character. But since The Amazing Spider-Man 2, outside of their projects with Marvel Studios, well, their live-action slate has definitely struggled. Yes, they found some pretty big success in the Spider-Verse animated films, but when it comes to everything else that they've worked on, well, there's been a lot of flops. Actually, The Amazing Spider-Man 3 and Sinister 6 were completely scrapped, but we got a whole series of Spider-Man adjacent villain movies, which encompassed Venom, Morbius, Madam Web, and Kraven the Hunter. And although some of the Venom projects did pretty well in the theaters, none of them were what we would call a massive hit. They were pretty much critical flops, and for the most part, commercial flops. And although the Venom franchise remained what many would call successful, each installment of that franchise actually grossed less and less. Now, there's a whole series of projects that were announced that never took off, including El Muerto, Spider-Woman, and Agent Venom. But they all fell by the wayside, which honestly came as a relief to many fans more than a disappointment, because these were projects most people simply didn't want. Now, it seemed like Sony was putting all these characters on the board to build up to something, and that was a face-off with Null, who was introduced in the third installment of Venom. But even after that movie was released, the general vibe for that universe had fallen to an all-time low, and that was damaged even more by the response to Kraven. Now, we got a new report from Daniel Rickman, and like I always like to say, this isn't from Tom Rothman at Sony or anybody official, so we're taking it with a grain of salt, but Rickman's got a pretty great track record, and I do pay attention to his reports. Now, what he is saying is that Sony has effectively paused all plans for its live-action Spider-Man spin-offs, including a planned Null project. Now, is this a time for celebration? Well, maybe, but it's always sad to see things that we were kind of interested in fail. Honestly, I think Sony probably made a huge mistake just doing villain projects, and they always needed their own Spider-Man. Now, I wouldn't have trusted them with Tom Holland's Spider-Man, and they did have a lot of misses, but they were clearly on the wrong path and trajectory from day one, and we were all sort of waiting, especially after the massive flop that was Madam Web, for this situation to reach this stage. Now, what's this mean for the future? Well, there's a lot of rumors going on out in the universe, and obviously the idea is that Spider-Man could return in whole to Marvel Studios. Now, Sony likes their profitable franchises, so they're really going to need something to glom onto if they were to ever give up Spider-Man. And there have been some recent reports that there is a possibility they could pick up another major comic book franchise in the form of DC Studios. We all know Warner Bros. Discovery is in pretty bad shape, and there definitely seems to be a plan from David Zaslav to potentially sell DC Studios once it establishes a level of success. The hype surrounding Superman is massive, and it might be $1 billion film. And as they realign their corporate structure, they are splitting their television and movie houses into different entities. Well, the possibilities of DC Studios getting sold is a real thing, and one studio that might actually be interested is Sony. Now, for me, the idea of DC Studios under a Sony leadership is absolutely terrifying, and I'm definitely not endorsing that. But Zaslav is all about the bottom line, and Sony's leadership, Tom Rothman, definitely needs some bankable franchises, and the DC Universe might be exactly that. Now, the larger impact, we really don't know. I can't imagine James Gunn working for a really meddlesome studio. Sony does like to meddle in people's projects, and Gunn is really not down for that. So if this does happen, I totally see a massive change in leadership at the head of DC Studios if they have to report to Rothman. Now, interestingly, if that does happen, apparently the rights to Spider-Man revert back to Marvel Studios, and I could totally see Sony potentially doing that if they pick up characters like Batman and Superman. But this all lives in the realm of speculation at this point. Now, obviously, we're going to follow this pretty closely. Sony's live-action Spider-Man universe coming to an end is not a real tragedy. I actually think it was hurting the superhero genre in general with bad products. So we're going to take this as a win for right now, but pay close attention and hopefully Sony doesn't soil DC Studios. We're going to have to wait and see. Before we take off, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button and ring the bell for all the updates. We do daily Marvel and DC news, and we want to bring you all the news truthfully and transparently so you're really in the know.